Welcome to the Unity Forum, a cross-partisan program dedicated to fostering reasoned discourse and a more open society. In each episode, we talk with well-established experts to provide insight on recent events, elevate civil dialogue, and encourage greater mutual understanding on social, economic, and legal issues. Our host is Chris Malone, founder of Fidelum Group and author of the award-winning book, The Human Brand: How We Relate to People, Products, and Companies.
Hello and welcome. I'm Chris Malone and I'll be your host for today's discussion. Thank you for joining us. Our guest today is Dan Hesse, who currently serves as Chairman of Akamai Technologies, as a board member of PNC Financial Services Group, where he chairs the Technology Committee. Dan served as President and CEO of Sprint Corporation from 2007 to 2014, and previously he was Chairman and CEO of Embark Corporation, Chairman, President, and CEO of TerraBeam Corporation, and he spent 23 years at AT&T from 1997 to 2000. He served as President and CTO of AT&T Wireless, which at the time was the nation's largest wireless carrier. The American Customer Satisfaction Index recognized Sprint as the most improved U.S. company in overall customer satisfaction across all 43 industries from 2008 to 2014. And during Dan's years at Sprint, the company was recognized 20 times by J.D. Power and Associates for excellence in customer service, and the Reputation Institute recognized Sprint as the most improved company in overall corporate reputation among the world's largest public companies. For his last 2 full calendar years as CEO, Sprint's total shareholder return ranked number 1 among all S&P 500 companies. And now Dan also co-hosts the Mentors radio program, which is carried on all major podcast platforms. Welcome to the Unity Forum, Dan.
Well, thanks, Chris. It's a real pleasure to be with you.
Now, as a longtime CEO and board leader, how do you view the corporate relationship for leaders between leadership and democratic health? Do leaders have a responsibility to get involved in this stuff? What's your take on that?
Well, first of all, if you just think of the country that we live in and work in, what makes America unique is kind of the strength of our democracy and the strength of our economy, which is our capitalist system. If you think of them, it's kind of like peanut butter and chocolate. They're meant to go together. Democracy is the free flow of ideas, and capitalism is really the free flow of capital. And it basically lets capital go to the best ideas. So they are, they mix together so well, and it's really what makes the country as strong as it is.
Well, I think that's a really great analogy, and one where business just operates, I think, a little bit more smoothly and a little bit more predictably in a stable environment of laws and things of that nature, correct?
Yeah, and the institutions are really important. So, one of the things that I think a lot of us watched recently, and again, as you say, this is not nothing I'm saying is political in any way or meant to be. It's just observation. So you'd think that, we know this, I watch CNBC all the time, and the stock market, in terms of how strong it is largely based upon how many rate cuts they think are coming. There's this relationship between equity values and interest rates. The lower the interest rates, the higher the equity values, not only because it means the discounted cash flows have a lower interest rate, so stocks tend to be higher, but also means you're less likely to have money in savings and more likely to put it in equities if interest rates are low. So our current president is considered business friendly, Wall Street friendly, wants lower interest rates because that's good for the economy. So you'd think if he would say, I'm going to put a new Fed chair in there who's going to be more aggressive at lowering interest rates, that would be good for equities and good for the stock market. But as soon as he threatened that, the stock market crashed. Why? And you'd say that's counterintuitive. And aren't lower interest rates good? Because of the strengths of our institutions, what makes our economy, and we'll call it our democracy, so strong. Investors and business leaders knew that was more important than the policy, was that structure that we have.
No, it's an excellent point. And you may know that we had as a guest on the program a few months ago a former president of the Federal Reserve Bank of Philadelphia, where he made similar remarks that yes, we all want lower interest rates, but many of the biggest buyers of US debt are outside the United States. And so they need to have trust in the reliability and the stability of those interest rates as well.
Yeah, and just, getting back to the institutions, the other thing that was on TV not long ago, a lot of us watched, and it was lots of episodes and it was lots of hours, but, Ken Burns does these great documentaries, and he had one on the American Revolution and the principles upon which this country was built. These guys were geniuses in terms of really the way they structured it. And they were also, most of them were rich and they were businessmen. So they had, so they were thinking about it with both their, we'll call it their hearts, as well as their minds and their pocketbooks. So I think they largely got it right.
Now, during your time leading Sprint and now as chair at Akamai, how have you navigated those moments when kind of business interests and civic values may not have always perfectly aligned? I'm sure that you have to navigate some challenging situations as a leader. How do you make choices and navigate through those?
Well, I think, that's where your company's culture is so important. That really becomes your North Star. It's your set of, cultures are basically a set of values and behaviors, how a company operates. One example would be, years ago when we were at Sprint, when smartphones were coming out, and Facebook and all these other apps, everybody realized, wow, how valuable customer data was. We could sell customers data and make a ton of money. And we sat around as a leadership team and goes, yeah, we could, but we don't think it's right. It's definitely good for the bottom line, and it's allowed, and lots of people are doing it, but it's not really who we are. And so, at that time, you have to get customer permission. They can opt in or opt out. You had to opt out, consumers, if you didn't want your data used, and you read this like 15 pages of small print. And so we said, we're going to have customers opt in. We're not going to use any of your data for targeted advertising or what have you. It cost us millions of dollars, but we just thought it was the right thing to do to build trust. And I was the chairman of the CTIA at the time, and I got up on stage and asked my brethren, my other phone network CEOs and what have you, and cable companies and what have you. No one went along with it. We were the only one. But those are the kinds of things that, business leaders need to make decisions from time to time, whether it's political, economic, what's allowed, what's not allowed, based upon your core set of values. And that's just one example of what I think makes sense.
In this country, political winds shift over time in one direction or another. And at times there are some things that are more in favor or less in favor, what have you. And to that point, I wonder how you have seen organizations navigate through things like their commitment to diversity or other types of benefits or things of that nature. Is that something where you think that organizations naturally, I think, want to kind of stay out of the crosshairs as a business practice, but how do you navigate those things when the values of the company may not be in perfect alignment with the way things are blowing politically?
Yeah, well, I think the first thing is, you don't speak about things publicly. You don't need to. Your employees know, because that's your number one constituency.
Mm-hmm.
Your customers are, I would say, number two, but number one are really your employees, and it's what you do. The other thing I coach other CEOs and have friends on boards, I say there's strength in numbers. That is, if you want to do something, get on the phone. And one of the reasons you have relationships or you belong to organizations, let's say like the Business Council or the Business Roundtable or Just Capital Foundation or what have you, if collectively a whole bunch of companies do something, you're much less likely to stand out or have repercussions for doing what you think is right. And I think that's probably number one. And sometimes missed is the opportunity to reach out to colleagues and like-minded people and in business and do things collectively. But I think, again, getting back to culture, that's your North Star. And if you ever deviate from that, you're going to lose your most important resource, which is your people, either by their legs or you'll lose their hearts and minds. And you can't,
Right.
and you can't do that. That's actually that's really bad for shareholders.
I can certainly understand. I think for most of my own career, conventional wisdom is business is separate from political beliefs, and as a business, we try to remain neutral in that and not become partisan involved in things. But at what point does it become not about partisanship and more about preserving that democratic environment? So when you kind of look out and what's happening in our country right now, what do you think, if anything, should concern those of us in the business community about kind of the foundational democratic environment, setting aside which policies or positions one might have from a more partisan standpoint?
Well, I think just generally, I think this gets partly part two of even the last question is you don't focus on outcomes, you focus on, we'll call it process and institutions, and you support those. And some may read into it, and they can if they want. Oh, that's a political statement, or that's not. It's generally not intended to. So, for example, I think back in, I think it was 2020, the Business Roundtable came out about the elections and election integrity and what have you. That's focusing on the process. It was never, you're not talking about the outcome. And so I think, regardless of what it is, as business leaders, focus on process, focus on the institutions, and not on the outcome. The other thing is, I think from with getting back to culture, it's with your employees is, do you create that opportunity for open dialogue inside the company? How do we behave as a firm? And I think if you really focus on culture and, we'll just take Sprint's culture, its key tenets were teamwork, camaraderie, integrity. If that's the basis, there's all sorts of things you can talk about when you focus on what you have in common and the way you talk. What I really, I would say the one thing that's happening out there that if I were still a CEO, that I think I would be standing up against, and that is personal attacks at the political level. That has no role whatsoever, ever, is personal attacks versus policy. There's actually a great article that came out, some research done at the University of Notre Dame, article that was written, which is, unfortunately, politicians are realizing that it's to their advantage to make personal attacks because that's what the media covers. They personal attacks sell magazines, sells eyeballs, and that's what they're doing. And we'll call it policy discourse has become much, much less important. And actually, there was an article in the Wall Street Journal today, I was looking at it, saying it's kind of, Congress now is performance theater, and they're using WWE. They had pictures of, World Wrestling. It's really about the performance of the fight rather than really what's happening. That is what I would really lean into. And both parties are guilty of this right now. And it's a nature of the system that we've, as business leaders, I think we can make a difference if we really start calling that out, because that's a nonpartisan issue.
Well said. Now, as a leader, do you feel that inside companies and as part of the culture, should we be kind of leaving our political beliefs at the door when we arrive at work? Or is that something that can be discussed constructively in any certain situations or contexts within an organization? As a leader, how do you want that managed within inside the company? Are some of that kind of democratic process part of culture, or are those entirely different and that we just keep that in our personal life?
I think policies that impact the business, and just talking about it from a policy point of view, is just fine. I think we should leave, though, our political views at the door. Now, some people say that's easier said than done, because what used to be just a policy issue can be viewed as political now. So, for example, way back when I started getting involved in ecological issues a long time ago, the environment and green issues, because of the industry I'm in. I remember reading an article, this was decades ago, that you could, maybe 15, 20 years ago, that you could line up dump trucks nose to nose from Washington, D.C. to Orlando, Florida, with just basically discarded e-waste, mainly cell phones, because we gave people free phones every year, that ended up in our nation's landfills. And they had mercury, cadmium, all this stuff, which was polluting our water and what have you. And then, of course, there's the energy used to manufacture new phones versus for all those kinds of things. And that really was not considered a political issue at all. That was just an economic issue. How can we make the economics of phone recycling and reuse make sense. Unfortunately, today, a lot of those things can be construed as political. And I think if you have this trust where your people trust you, that you're looking out for the country's interest, you're looking out for your company's interests, and these things are not political, I think and you focus on what you have in common. I think it's doable. So in the boardrooms that I'm in, we talk about these issues, and some of them are, if taken up by one party or another, and you do your best to not take it there. But it's becoming increasingly more difficult. I don't want to belittle that.
Yeah, and I think you make good points on the importance of finding the common ground, right? The things that impact us all, that from a business standpoint have impact on the business, that we should be able to talk about openly.
There's so much more common ground, and you need to find those things, and that's why culture is so important, because this is the overall problem we have in the country is that people don't talk about what we have in common, and we don't see each other as people. I'm making an overlook, we see them as them. It's kind of this whole issue of them versus us. I had a recent guest on the Mentors Radio. You mentioned it earlier, Senator Jack Danforth of Missouri. He's a retired senator. He was also U.S. ambassador to the UN. He was a Republican, and we would say conservative. But what he is trying to do, he's also an ordained Episcopalian minister, and so for him, it's values and focusing on what we as humans have in common, and then we can work on, common problems, and we just see each other as people. He actually talked about the important role he believes that local organizations of all kinds, civic organizations and congregations, religious congregations, can play to help reduce our political divide. I mean, I'll say, I'm Catholic, for example. I mean, everybody has a different religion. I will tell you that my Catholic friends are all over the map politically. I mean, they're all over the map. You can take an issue like, I don't talk about where I am, but for example, pro-life. That's a big issue. That the Catholic Church as a church is very pro-life, but you have lots of members of the church, women in particular, who are pro-choice. And that doesn't make them any less Catholic, in my view, or do people who disagree on a lot of other things. You're just going to disagree on issues, but there's an opportunity for congregations, I believe, also to, if you will, play a role to start, bringing us together. Getting back to Danforth, in terms of knowing people as people, the one example he gave that I really resonated with me is he was a newly elected Republican senator from Missouri. The other senator, the senior senator from Missouri, was Eagleton, a Democrat, and they were very opposed, if you will, on polar opposites politically. Danforth was quite conservative. Eagleton was quite liberal, but they had, his first day in Congress, Senator Eagleton came up, and Danforth was like, "Oh no," and Eagleton said, "Jack, I'm so sorry to hear about your father." And Danforth had just recently lost his father, and Eagleton had also about a year earlier lost his father, and they developed this personal bond about two sons grieving over the loss of great fathers, and from then on, they were like best friends. They always disagreed, I mean, often on political issues, but they saw each other as human beings. And I think we just need to get back to that somehow. And that's getting back to the personal attack issue. Let's get that out of our process and our vernacular, just like we do in companies. As CEOs, we don't allow that. That's the one thing as part of a culture, you do not allow personal attacks. We should lean in and not allow it as acceptable behavior in the political arena either.
That's a great point, and it actually harkens back to something you and I were just talking about before we started the program. It makes me realize when you talk about Senator Danforth, it's about not only finding that common ground, but preserving those relationships of trust, whether we're people with differing views or across the aisle or what have you, that we can disagree on issues, but we need to maintain that relationship and keep the dialogue and keep focused on the common ground.
It's so true. And I've talked to congressmen who, from days past, and they miss those days of going out to dinner regularly with their colleagues on the other side and being in their homes and all those kinds of things. And, in essence, developing real relationships with those who are on the other side of the aisle. Now, if, the people in your clan know you've got a relationship with somebody on the other side, you're no longer trusted. It's crazy.
Yeah, it's a good example. So in this age of political polarization, should companies be promoting civic engagement and informed dialogue to their employees, customers, and shareholders? Or is it possible to do that without being partisan? Where does that lie in your view?
I think companies absolutely can do that and need to do that. So for example, when I was running Sprint, I made a big deal the week leading up to voting and sent letters and voicemails. Vote. That is your responsibility. Vote. Because I knew that in business in particular, there's this belief that I don't take my job seriously enough if I come in late or I leave early to go vote because I've got work to do. I made it really clear because everybody in the whole chain of command needed to know, no, you're more or less required, for lack of a better term, but you're expected to go vote. The other thing in terms of my senior leadership team, everybody was required, I'd say required with a small r, strongly encouraged to be a board member or involved in a civic organization that's helping the community in some way, and i.e. doing something for your community. And every community organization has people on both sides of the aisle, just by definition, it just does. And so I think that businesses can play a role in terms of the expectations that business leaders set for their people in terms of what they do. And of course, as the CEO, you got to walk the talk. I mean, you can't just say it, you've actually got to do it. And I hate to say this, people will say this, oh, Dan, this is being political. No, it's not. I'm a big fan of mail-in voting because I had such and still do, heavy travel schedule across the country. I didn't want to always have to know I would be in Kansas City, Missouri, for example, on election day. If there was something else, I wanted to make sure I voted. I wanted to vote in person, but if I couldn't, just the ability to do that was something that I valued. So I always was a proponent of mail-in voting, mainly because of my travel schedule.
Yeah, as many do. Now, you've written and spoken quite a bit about ethical leadership. And I'm wondering where democratic values may intersect with your kind of definition of integrity and how that kind of fosters into the way you lead as well. Are those two things connected or are they independent in your view?
They're both connected and they're independent. I mean, they're different. So I used to talk about, when I talked about our culture, I would talk about a lot of these issues that we've been talking about, but said, listen, I want everybody to speak openly and speak freely of what you think. So very much like, politics is all about the freedom of expression. I want that inside the company as well. If you don't agree, speak up, please. Tell me you don't agree. But I'd always say, it's not a democracy though here. I'm accountable. I'm going to make the decision. So, we'll go around the table, let's say in a meeting, I'll get everybody's point of view, and I may be the only one who holds a particular, if you can't persuade me, I'm still accountable and I'm going to make the call. It's not a democracy. So people understood what was common and different about a business and a country. And that is a lot of the values and principles, that is open dialogue, listening, communication, freedom of expression. They apply in both, but there's a level of accountability in business. At the end of the day, it's me. I'm accountable, whether it's the right thing or the wrong thing. I take the blame, or I'll take the credit. Kind of like, you get too much blame and you get too much credit when you're CEO.
Now, you are a mentor to many leaders in the work that you do on the Mentors Radio program and even outside that program. Do you think that whether it's business schools or mentors should be doing more to prepare future executives to engage with democracy and democratic principles as part of their leadership responsibilities? I know when I went through business school, it wasn't really an area of focus, but is that something that's missing in today's boardrooms, or what are you seeing?
Well, I think that I'd like to see continued education and focus on culture building as the job of a leader. And I think this fits in very well. So for example, I'm on the faculty of what's called the CEO Academy at the University of Missouri. And that's what I teach. I teach culture. And a lot of culture is this notion of how to create open dialogue, um, and shared values. So what do we have in common? And we have a way that we talk with each other and a way that we engage with each other that I think also relates. We also, at the CEO Academy, talk about the important role the leader plays in terms of civic responsibility and the company's role in civic responsibility and civic engagement. Related to that, one of the faculty talks about the importance of feedback. And it's, as CEO, people aren't willing to give you that because it's not a blind voting booth. So for in democracy, you can go in and you don't have to tell people how you vote, that people can vote. The CEO's breath stinks or whatever. They can, they could do that in the secrecy of the voting booth. In business, people are very unlikely to tell you to your face what your weaknesses are or where they disagree with you. And actually, one of the lessons in that particular, in the CEO Academy is, how as CEO do you ensure that you're getting the true story, that you're getting all the facts? How do you really encourage feedback and receive true unvarnished feedback? So I think there's more that can be done in business to create leaders that also help develop a better, we'll call it civic and political environment.
Yeah, I think that's a great point, because as leaders, we often can get surrounded by people that want to seem supportive and agree and all of that, but really encouraging them to provide feedback in ways that do challenge maybe our assumptions, show that it's a safe place to have that dialogue, can really change the dynamic.
Yeah, absolutely.
Now, looking ahead for the rest of 2026 and beyond, in your view, what kind of leadership do we need most right now to ensure that our democracy remains strong and inclusive, both from a business standpoint, a private standpoint, as well as from a public standpoint? Any thoughts on that?
Well, getting back to a point I said earlier is focusing, if we as leaders, as business leaders, can try to focus our political leaders on policy, and versus personal attacks. I think there's an opportunity. In business we have KPIs. We measure. I think businesses should start a way of measuring our leaders, our political leaders, in terms of the kind of leaders we want, based upon two key KPIs in my view. One is personal attacks versus talking about policy. I think we could come up with that. And the other is the number of bills that they sponsor or co-sponsor that get passed, i.e. how much, we'll call it productivity. You're measured in work done. You have so many politicians out there that are basically, they're just performance artists. That's all they're doing. They're performing, they're attacking, they're not doing anything. And that's what we really need in our leadership. And this is not a political statement at all. We need a government that works. And right now it's just not working because nothing gets done. There's very little policy debate. It's all personal. And there's very little, cooperation. So basically the only way that anything gets done is if one party is in power with control of both houses. And what we know is likely to come in November, because it pretty much has with almost every president, is we'll have split house, and then really nothing will get done. And so it's really urgent, I believe, that we figure out a way of getting more done. But it's
More productivity, less posturing.
Yes, productivity. It's a good way of putting it. We need to focus on that some way.
Absolutely. Now let's take a few questions from our audience that are listening. We do have a question here from Harris Contos. It's a little bit lengthy, but the gist of it is, how strong can our democracy be if our economy isn't strong? The debt to GDP ratio approaching 120%, all kinds of things going on with the economy and debt and so forth. Are those two things really strongly related, the strength of our democracy and the strength of our economy? He seems to be suggesting that both are in trouble.
Well, we've always had economic struggles and issues. I mean, we've gone in and out of recessions, and the one thing that has survived all recessions has been our democracy. And so, but by the way, I do believe there's a relationship between the two. And it's quite frankly why, if the strength of our economy is what funds, we'll call it the strength of our military, and we'll call it the strength of our, democratic system. I do think they go hand in hand because it is the notion of the free flow of ideas, and the free flow of capitalism. Capitalism isn't perfect. That's why I joined the board and was for a long time of Just Capital. It's not perfect. It is the best system, though, ever tried. So we know socialism and communism don't work. I mean, unless the goal is a weak economy. That's what, that's why, China has moved, as far, people say it's really not, it is kind of government controlled, but it's very, very capitalistic now because that does work better. So, issues like income disparity and what have you, those are things we could get better at. But our economy is pretty darn strong. And I think because of our economy is so strong and our democracy is so strong, our adversaries, and quite frankly, related to that, our military is really quite strong, are attacking us by trying to divide us. So, I serve on the board of a cybersecurity company, where, I chair it. I chair the technology committee of another board. The amount of misinformation online is unbelievable. And people believe they're getting this, information from Katie in Kentucky or Matt in Missouri. No, it's probably Ivan in Moscow and Xiao Ying in Beijing, who has a fake account, who's providing all this information. The amount of misinformation is that's really dividing us out there is incredible. And it's stunning to me how many people read stuff online. And if it's not from either a vetted source like, CBS or CBS or, whoever it might be, whoever your trusted news source, or somebody that they believe it. I'm going, what do you mean you believe it? Do you know this person? How can you? Yesterday, and I'm not exaggerating, these are two, we'll call it celebrities that I happen to know personally. I'm on Facebook and I saw two different things come out on Facebook on pretty well-known kind of feeds, but they're still like Facebook feeds, that were the information about these two people was completely wrong. But it's got all these views and all these clicks. There's no truth to it because I happen to know them. So, getting back to strength of our democracy, this is really what our adversaries are going after. They can't beat us economically. You can say whatever you want about our economy could be better. It crushes any other economy in the world. And actually, for years it was China was catching up. Now China, we're increasing our lead over China in terms of GDP and everything else because of our economy. It could be stronger, but it's by far the best in the world. They're coming after our democracy and trying to divide us because the only way the United States can fall, in my view, is from within. They can't beat us from outside. We're just too tough.
No, I would tend to agree. Here's another question from Grace Uguana. And she appreciates these insights, appreciates the fact that we have mentioned de-emphasizing personal attacks and focused on policy and economic issues. She asks, what strategies can politicians engage in to minimize personal attacks? If they're kind of on the receiving end of those, is there any thought that you may have on that? Is there a way to navigate around it without getting drawn into it?
It's difficult. I think if there was, so for example, Just Capital, I think was really effective in helping to provide air cover and support to businesses who wanted to, say, do the right thing. I'm hoping that business and others can begin to support politicians that act the right way. I do know of a couple people in Congress who are trying to get more like breakfasts and dinners and those kinds of things where you're sharing a meal together, inviting people from across the aisle to ways of just getting to know each other as people. It completely changes the dialogue, I believe. So I don't know what that I see as very promising, is members of Congress actually really working, just whether it's social, they have softball games, all these kinds of things, or meals that get people to know each other outside the office. I think it will make a big difference, but there's no easy answer here.
Yeah, I think you make a good observation about the importance of people getting together in person outside the office. It's a lot more socially awkward to have these heated, nasty, personal attack debates in person, just by kind of physical presence and so forth. And I think the fact that so much of our communication is now remote and social media and virtual and all of that makes it easier for people to get drawn into those things, unfortunately.
I think, and also just knowing them. So when you get to know them, you usually know that they're fathers or mothers, and you're less likely to attack somebody if you know, well, they were talking about their kids, and their kids are going to be hearing and reading this. You go, you internalize it yourself. You see them as a father or a mother. You're much less likely to attack them because you care about what their kids or their family reads and hears. So I don't know, there's just on lots of levels, Chris, just like you mentioned, I think knowing people as people make such a difference.
So finally, for business leaders who may be feeling kind of apprehensive or uncertain about how to navigate the current environment and what's ahead, do you have any kind of closing thoughts of hope, inspiration, or guidance so that you can draw on from your career and your leadership experiences that might encourage us?
I personally think, in terms of leading leading your company, is focus on culture. Make sure you define your culture to the extent you can. Engage all your people in helping create and define your culture. Talk about those principles on a regular basis. So we would pretty much all our quarterly meetings. We would rank. We would have KPIs around all of our culture items. Are we walking the talk on each one of them? What are external measures? How are we doing on these things? Basically, it's what unifies all of us. And I think as business leaders, if you unify your own team, and you know that you have your own team with vastly different political views, but we would have lots of get-togethers, before work, after work, in the lunchroom, you'd go table to table, you get to know people, just work on what you can, which is your own company. If your company, you all are close as people. So for example, my leadership team at Sprint, every 4 months or so, we get together on a Zoom. We'll have people coming in from all across the country. And, I retired over a decade ago to Kansas City. We're going to have a big, reunion in October, including the members of the board. And I can tell you, because I know them, very different political views, but we shared something in common, an objective. And I think if we all see each other as not only people, but all Americans, we're Americans first. I think we can, we can make progress. But again, I'll just conclude it. For business people, focus on culture. If your culture is not defined, define it and measure it.
Great advice. Dan, thank you so much for another insightful and thought-provoking conversation. It's been a real pleasure talking with you. I'd like to thank the listeners as well today for your time and your thoughtful questions. And be sure to join us for another episode of the Unity Forum, where we'll talk to another established leader. But until then, have a great rest of your day. Thanks very much, everyone.
Thanks for listening today. If you enjoyed this episode of the Unity Forum, please give it a rating, share it with others, and join us on Facebook at Alumni for Freedom and Democracy. And be sure to join us next time for another thought-provoking discussion on the big ideas shaping our collective future.